Okay, thanks, Steve. I suggest we start now. We've got over 40 people here. A few more may join us later. Welcome, everybody. I'm Duncan Bowie. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Socialist Society, and I'm really pleased to have Michael Ward here to talk about his book on the webs. I've known Michael on and off probably for about 30 or 40 years. And I was actually at the book launch and have read it and have even written a review of it. It's a marvelous book. I personally didn't think I was anything more about the webs I could possibly learn, but I was wrong. So those of you that think you've read everything about the webs, read this book. Most people will know a bit about Michael's background. Michael studied politics, philosophy, and economics at University College, Oxford, and then economic and social history at Birkbeck. He was elected to the Greater London Council in 1981 and led the GLC's economic development work for 5 years. That sad day when he was also briefly deputy leader to Ken Livingstone in the last few months. That sad day when the GLC was abolished, which many of us will remember, Michael moved to Manchester to set up the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. But when London government got brought back in 2000, Michael returned to London and became the first chief executive of the London Development Agency. I actually worked for the mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, for a number of years at the same time. And I remember the work that Michael did at the LDA. I was working on the housing and planning side at the time. Michael has written this, as he said, this massive web-like book or web-length book, and he's going to give a talk for us. He's going to be showing us some slides. He'll probably be talking for maybe sort of 35, 40 minutes. We'll see. He can talk longer if he wishes to, and then we'll have lots of time for questions and comments. But please, mute your microphones while Mike is speaking. After he finishes, if you can then either put your hand up using the responses button, the actions button, or if you don't know how to do that, put your camera on and wave at me. But over to Mike now. Welcome.
Well, Duncan, thank you very much for that introduction. I've prepared some slides to go with this talk, and so I'm going to go over to sharing the screen now. And if I can see it, yes, there we are. Good. Okay, well, in discussing what we might talk about tonight, I thought I would focus on what the case was for a new study of the webs. People say, oh, surely lots has been written. Yes, there has been a lot written, but actually not very recently. Just one word on this title slide. As you'll see, there are some quite good cartoons of Sidney around, very few of the two of them, and there are a couple of Will Dyson cartoons that show them, but in scenes with lots of other people that take quite a lot of explanation. This is actually a more recent cartoon from the New York Review of Books at some point, but it is at least one that shows the two of them. I put this up just to show the range of books that exist. This is part of the selection that I have of web biographies, and they're all very different. But I'll come back to that a little later on. So what I want to talk about tonight, and there's the title page of my book. First of all, they call themselves the firm of Webb, and just a little bit about the two of them. I can say more later if people would like. Secondly, something about the way their politics evolved. Third, something about their role in building institutions. A bit about previous attempts to cover their lives, and then finally I want to say something about sources, because I think the sources provide some quite interesting issues. So here they are, a couple of drawings of them done in the early 20th century. Very different backgrounds. Sidney, a Londoner. His mother ran a hairdressing salon just off Leicester Square. He worked as a civil servant. He worked his way up through competitive exams, starting at the age of, I suppose, 17 or 18. By the time he was 22, he was as far advanced as the people coming in for what now would be called the fast stream. He was a master of the competitive exam system. Beatrice was born at a family home in Gloucestershire. Her father was a very successful businessman, chaired the Great Western Railway, chaired other companies, originally chaired a timber merchant, chaired American Railways. She was determined as a young woman to work independently of the family, and she worked first as a researcher on Charles Booth's survey, The Life and Labour of the People of London, did research and writing of her own, and then in managing social housing in East London. They came together in their early 30s and they married in July 1892. At least that, as I say, I can say more about that if people would like to hear more. When I told people that I was working on the webs, one of the comments was, surely it's all been written before. But another was a surprising number of people didn't even, including people who'd done history degrees, a surprising number of people didn't know who the Webbs were. And of those who did know, they tend to know two things. They tend to know that they had a great part in the founding of the welfare state. And they tend to know about their later support for the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And in a way, what comes out of this is, yes, those two things are very important parts of the story, but they are not the whole of the story, and there is a great deal more to tell. This is a photograph, incidentally, taken by H.G. Wells of, again, in the, I suppose, early 1900s. Their politics went through three stages. First, permeation, trying to influence people across the political spectrum. Secondly, social democracy, putting their faith in the Labour Party. And third, their commitment from the early 30s onwards to what they called a new civilization, the world of the Soviet Union. This early period, I show this cartoon, Sidney as the wire puller, the puppet master, manipulating the Conservative leader Arthur Balfour and the Liberal Prime Minister Henry Asquith. Their aim was to influence all parties. Beatrice has this line that a Conservative government is as good for us as a Liberal government. George Bernard Shaw encouraged them to run what he called a political salon for the socialist movement. They had a house on the Thames embankment, almost exactly where the Millbank Tower now stands. And there they used to entertain everybody, politicians, writers, trade unionists, local councillors. Typically, they were said to provide very meagre food, but people didn't go for the food, they went for the discussion. H.G. Wells called their entertaining a shameless austerity. It kept the conversation brilliant. Soup, a plain fish, and mutton or boiled fowl, and a milk pudding. But people came. And years later, Herbert Samuel, one of the Liberals who used to go there as a young man, said, we didn't go for the food, we went for the conversation. We were all there for a purpose. We knew that, and Beatrice confirmed that. Permeation worked for a while. Sidney was a member of the London County Council and developed its secondary education programme. All kinds of issues about the powers and who'd done it before, but he built up a secondary education system. He then worked with the Conservative government nationally to extend that secondary education system nationally. And it certainly led to a massive increase in publicly funded secondary education. In doing that, he made two compromises that have haunted the education system ever since. One was to work with the old foundation schools in London, and the second was to work with the churches. He and Beatrice said this was the only way in the early 1900s that they could get that major extension. Their Liberal colleagues, and on the London County Council, Sidney was in alliance with the Liberals, didn't like this at all. And certainly Sidney, I think, alienated a lot of the nonconformist part of the Liberal movement, and this made their lives more difficult later. In 1905, the last act of Balfour's Conservative government was to appoint a royal commission to look at the poor law. Beatrice was made a member of it. Almost immediately after the commission was appointed, we had a general election and a massive Liberal landslide, so that the commission appointed by Liberals had to report to a Conservative government. Beatrice, I think, deliberately divided the commission and then wrote a minority report. 4 members, one of them George Lansbury, another Beatrice herself, signed the minority report. They called for the abolition of the poor law. The majority report said you kept the poor law whole and entire, but passed it over to local authorities. Beatrice's recommendation was that the education of poor children went to the ordinary education system, that the poor law medical provision was amalgamated with the general medical provision and a much more ambitious medical service put together. It became clear fairly quickly that the government was not going to endorse the report, and so they started a massive campaign to deliver the minority report. They didn't succeed. And in May 1911, they took a year off and travelled around the world. When they came back, they made a commitment to Labour. This great Beatrice statement that the Labour Party was a poor thing, but our own. They made this Beatrice joined the Independent Labour Party and worked with the Independent Labour Party and other socialist groups for a continuing anti-poverty campaign in the years before the First World War. Sidney, at the beginning of the war, became involved in what was called the War Emergency Workers National Committee, designed to look at bread and butter issues as they affected families left behind. Not the pay and conditions of service people, but the money that came back, the rents and prices people had to pay. This got him close to the Labour movement, and he also was made the Fabian Society representative on the Labour Party National Executive. During the war, he led a complete reorganization. They hired Leonard Woolf to write their international policy, to write a set of war aims, which were not simply about unconditional victory for one side, but were about the kind of world that people wanted to create afterwards. Then they wrote what was the Labour Party's first national political programme, Labour and the New Social Order. They worked out a constitution for the Labour Party with individual members for the first time, and the first clearly socialist objective, the famous Clause 4, securing for the workers by hand or by brain the full fruit of their labour. Sidney worked closely with the miners, with the mining unions after the war, and became, aged over 60, became a member of Parliament for a mining area in 1922. And he chaired the Labour Party in 1923 and made his great statement of the Labour position, in which he said, he used this famous phrase, inevitable gradualness. but he argued that Labour was rooted in democracy and was not an organisation that would achieve overnight change. He quoted George Bernard Shaw as saying that, of course, you could nationalise the railways in an afternoon, but it would take rather longer to turn all the first-class carriages and the third-class carriages into second-class carriages. And he said, he used the phrase, why, because we're idealists, do they think we're idiots? So he became a minister in the 1924 and 1929 to 31 Labour governments. The dominant issue for 1920s politics was unemployment. In 1924, Sidney chaired the Cabinet Committee on Unemployment, of which the main achievement was John Wheatley's housing programme. They had no strategic unemployment policy, but crucially, they did no new thinking between 1924 and 29. The Conservative government that replaced them in 1925, returned the country to the gold standard, pricing sterling as it had been in 1914. Industries like coal were already finding it hard to recover their export markets. After that, it was almost impossible. Not long after the 1929 government comes in, you get the Wall Street crash, the gradual rise of unemployment, and the crisis on spending. Collapse of the MacDonald Labour government in August 1931. It is just worth saying in this that Sidney was, in my view, a hardworking and effective minister in the 1929 to 31 government. He was colonial secretary, which was a much bigger job than perhaps it sounds now, responsible, among other issues, for policy in East Africa, where he inherited a conservative attempt to create a second dominion like South Africa based on the East African colonies. And he was also responsible for Palestine, where in the end he was overruled by others in the government. But he wrote a report which said if present patterns of migration and land settlement continue, you run the risk in Palestine of creating a permanently excluded landless minority, which seems to me rather a prescient thing to have said. When the MacDonald government fell, they were very disillusioned with Labour. They hadn't originally supported the Bolshevik Revolution. They had been very dubious about the Leeds Convention, which was called to celebrate the revolution. But they had begun to find out more, to talk to the Russian embassy in the 1929 to 31 period. In the summer of 1932, both in their mid-70s, they did an 8-week tour of Russia and Ukraine. They were guests of the government. They saw what they were supposed to see and they met who they were supposed to meet. They wrote the book afterwards, Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. If the controlled nature of their visit hadn't dealt with everything, they actually checked the proofs with Ivan Maisky, the Russian ambassador to Britain. Taylor said, AJP Taylor says, the most preposterous book ever written about the Soviet Union. On the famine in Ukraine, they blamed the victims. Sidney basically said the peasants had been sabotaging their own harvest. The purges were mostly after the publication of Soviet Communism. Beatrice was aware and anguished, but did not speak out. Did not speak out even though she was certainly very unhappy. It did not speak out even when people who she knew personally were killed. The previous Russian ambassador, Sokolnikov, was imprisoned, and he was killed in prison, I think, in 1937. A young woman, Rose Cohen, who had joined the Fabian Research Department during the war, later went and became a member of the Communist Party. In the 1920s, went to live in Russia herself, married a Russian, had a child in Russia. Before she married, she was twice received proposals of marriage from Harry Pollitt himself. Even Pollitt couldn't find out what had happened to her. She got told, Beatrice got told that Rose Cohen was all right and would be all right, but in fact she was shot. She was shot, I think, in 1937 or 38. Nevertheless, they never joined or supported the British Communist Party. They really were rather contemptuous of the British Communist Party, said that people in Britain would never support a political party that was controlled from another country. They remained active in the Labour Party and the Fabian Society. Sidney had a major stroke in 1938, but up to 1938, when he was 79 and Beatrice was 80, up to that year, they regularly attended Labour Party conferences. And Beatrice actually remained president of the Fabian Society until her death in 1943. They were deeply shocked by the Nazi-Soviet pact in August 1939. But after Hitler turned on the Soviet Union and invaded Russia in the summer of 1941, they became active campaigners for the alliance between Britain and the Soviet Union. They created or built 3 institutions. Beatrice sometimes talked about LSE and the New Statesman as their children. They built up a think tank, a university, and a weekly journal, the infrastructure of a political movement. And the infrastructure that, interestingly, more than, I suppose, 35 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we still have those institutions. So first, the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society, they didn't found. The Fabian Society, George Bernard Shaw joined a year after it had been set up. Sidney joined a year later than that. Shaw had already met Sidney and thought him the ablest man in England. The Fabian Society was led for 20 years by Shaw, by Sidney, and by 2 others, Graham Wallas and Sidney Olivier. H.G. Wells called them the old gang. Beatrice called them the Fabian Junta, which a phrase she uses in the trade union book. Sorry, I've jumped aside. I'll just try and go back. No, I'm going the wrong way. I should just have to exit for a moment and bring you back to where you're supposed to be. I'm just going to restart shared. Restart. Sorry about this. Just want to see which. I'll just get us back to where I was trying to be. Yes, I was on the Fabian Society. Okay. Great influx of new members after 1905. People like Clement Attlee, Rupert Brooke, a group of people like Brooke and Hugh Dalton, who joined at Cambridge, who Beatrice described as fervent and brilliant. Sidney served on the executive committee of the Fabian Society from 1885 to 1935. Beatrice joined the executive committee in 1913. Right, good, back to normal. Then the LSE. Henry Hutchinson was the clerk to the magistrates in Derby, and he became, as a solicitor, became a benefactor of the Fabian Society, used to endow lecture tours in the north of England, which Sidney and others did. He wrote a will in 1893, in which he left most of his estate, about £10,000, for the propaganda and purposes of the said society and its socialism. Then a year later, he shot himself. News of his death came to the Webbs when they were on holiday with George Bernard Shaw and other friends at a farm in Surrey. they decided very quickly that their money ought to go to an educational purpose. Founding slowly and quietly a London School of Economics and Political Science. They thought it would be fatal if they just put the money into the ordinary day-to-day work of the Fabian Society. They said, well, people would just stop paying subscriptions if they knew we had £10,000 to keep us going. So they started the LSE. It began operating in 1895. The first two directors of it were actually Conservatives, William Hewins and Halford Mackinder. In fact, Conservatives to the extent Hewins ended up working for Joseph Chamberlain on tariff reform. Mackinder, he was a Tory MP, Mackinder also became a Conservative MP. But by 1904, the LSE had 1,300 students, 20 professors. They had spent the £10,000 in 10 years, but they concluded that they had built a leading educational institution. Sidney sat on the board till, well, he chaired the board till 1911, remained a board member at the 1930s. Quite an active board member. He chaired the panel that in 1912 appointed Clement Attlee to a lectureship in social policy. Attlee, they already had their eye on. Attlee had, in the summer of 1909, when they got the Poor Law campaign going, they persuaded Attlee to give up his practice as a barrister, which he'd not been doing very long, and come and work for the Poor Law campaign as the meetings organizer. In 1919, when there was a vacancy for a director, they appointed William Beveridge. Beveridge, again, they had known by that stage for 15 years. They more or less mentored or coached him all the way through his life. When he was giving evidence to the Poor Law Commission, they spent a day taking him through his evidence and coaching him before he went there. They appointed him as director. 20 years later, it was still Sidney who had to persuade him to give up the job because of disagreements within the LSE. And it's of the Beveridge period, but I think it was the lady who subsequently became Lady Beveridge, who said LSE was an empire on which the concrete never sets. Both at LSE and in the wider Federal University of London, Beveridge had led a huge development campaign. Beveridge, to the end of his life, was a great supporter of the Webbs, and he thought the LSE was the best single thing they had done. And then the New Statesman. I said a moment ago that they came back from that world tour committed to Labour. Beatrice felt a clear call to leadership, and we feel we must start a new political weekly. They'd been a year travelling all over the place. They rented a rectory in Sussex for the summer, and they planned systematically both the editorial and the business side. They took Clifford Sharp, who'd been the editor of the Poor Law campaign, and made him the editor. George Bernard Shaw was closely involved. They also raised the money. Sidney wrote to George Bernard Shaw one day, "Can you find me a list of Shaw worshippers we can find to subscribe to the magazine?" They raised, they managed to get 2,300 subscribers by the time they started. And then they were even more delighted when at the end of the first year, most of them renewed their subscriptions. Sidney chaired the board for the first 10 years. In 1924, at the height of the, in the general election campaign, when the Labour government was falling and being rocked by the Zinoviev letter scandal, Clifford Sharp wrote a leading article which was very critical of Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister. And the New Statesman board met and sacked Clifford Sharp. Clifford Sharp went and lobbied George Bernard Shaw, and Shaw went back to the others and said, listen, if you sack somebody, if you sack an editor for attacking the Labour Party, you will turn the New Statesman into a Labour Party right or wrong magazine. And not only will you be responsible for what the magazine does, you also make the magazine responsible for the Labour Party. So they tolerated Sharp staying on, but he was drinking more and more. And he was in the end replaced in 1931 by Kingsley Martin, who remained the editor for 30 years. I now want to say a little bit about the history of writing the history of the Webbs, the historiography of the Webbs, if you like. The last general life of both Sidney and Beatrice was that by Lisanne Radici in 1984. In general, the biographies tend to focus more on Beatrice than Sidney. The first biographer was Mary Agnes Hamilton, also known as Molly Hamilton. She knew them well. She had been converted by Beatrice, listening to one of Beatrice's speeches in the Poor Law campaign. Mary Agnes Hamilton visited them both at Grosvenor Road and Passfield Corner. She experienced the salon at first hand. Much later, after she'd been an MP, she went back and became a civil servant, and she was a civil servant member of the Beveridge Committee. She had the advantage of having known them very closely for a long time. Then there are the Coles, Douglas and Margaret Cole. They began as critics. Douglas's first book in 1913 criticizes what he calls Sidney Webbicalism, and is very hostile. And he was quite rebellious within the Fabian Society, walking out at one point. They began as critics. By the 1940s, Margaret was their trusted trustee and executor. As one of the executors, in 1948, Margaret and the other trustees commissioned R.H. Tawney to write the official biography of the Webbs. Tawney quickly became disillusioned when he discovered Margaret Cole was writing her own book at the same time as he said this would be difficult, and he withdrew. Harold Lasky said that Mrs. Cole has taken over their legacy as a permanent source of income, and certainly they did control things very tightly. For the position of the trustees and executors was that for the first few years, they were not making the Webb archive available until the official biography had been written. So, for example, Eric Hobsbawm, who wrote his own PhD thesis on the Fabians, was not allowed to consult the Webb papers. In 1965, they made a second attempt to commission an official biography, and they turned to Royden Harrison. Harrison had been a student of Cole's, but his experience was quite like Tawney's. He wasn't told about other things that were going on. Kitty Muggeridge, who was a niece, one of Beatrice's younger sister, Rosie, had I think 2 children, but certainly her daughter, Kitty, later married Malcolm Muggeridge, wrote a biography. Again, it's a biography that is informed by a direct knowledge of the Webbs that a later writer could not have. Jeanne Mackenzie, who was the wife of Norman Mackenzie, together they edited the diaries and the letters. She wrote a book on their courtship. And Harrison felt he'd not been told about these things. He did persist, and he published volume 1, which takes the story up to 1905 in 2000. He died in 2002. There were some attempts by researchers and collaborators to continue the project. Certainly one of the people involved was Michael Barrett Brown, who told me, I suppose about 10 or 15 years ago, that he was continuing it, but it didn't happen. Harrison was not somebody who'd known the Webbs themselves, himself, but he was able to interview a lot of people who were still alive in the 60s and 70s who had known them. Clement Attlee, Bertrand Russell, Ivan Maisky, the Russian ambassador, Sheena Simon, who'd been one of the original Cambridge Fabians. And Harrison's book is very different from what I have written, but I think is a very serious and very scholarly study. It goes much further into the 19th century intellectual origins of the Webb thought than I do. And then I think it's worth mentioning this book, which is by a lady called Carol Seymour Jones, which appeared in 1992. It is a life of, she has this title, Beatrice Webb, Woman of Conflict. It is a life of Beatrice, not Sidney. It is certainly based on quite extensive and thorough research. It focuses very much on her relationship with Joseph Chamberlain. Joseph Chamberlain, the liberal unionist politician, involved in a rather complex courtship of himself and Beatrice in the 1880s, which in the end is unsuccessful. And basically, Seymour Jones argues that this shaped the whole of Beatrice's life. That it's an important influence, I think, is right, but I think that probably Seymour Jones overstates the influence that this has. Jones says in her preface that it is a story of choices between sexual desire for charismatic politician Joseph Chamberlain and a position of wealth and privilege, or a career as a sociologist and reformer in partnership with her husband Sidney, a man she found physically repulsive. Well, I looked at this. She does not say that she found him physically repulsive. She says that one of his opinions is repulsive, but she does not say that he is repulsive. They say some quite sharp things in their first year. So the Daily Mail, ever ready to help, comes in and reviews the book with the quote that's on the front cover there, a grimly fascinating study of sexual repression. And I think obviously there are important psychological influences, but this is a case that is overstated. And it's overstated, I think, it's perhaps easy to see how that is the case in regard to some of Seymour Jones's other work. She went on from this to write a biography of Vivian Eliot, T.S. Eliot's first wife. And just quoting from an obituary of Seymour Jones, so that the Eliot biography contains interpretations of poems that many Eliot scholars thought simply wrong, overemphasizing sexual implications which they denied were there. And from their marriage onwards, there is a constant stream of affectionate diary entries and letters about Sidney, very warm, very affectionate. To sustain the Seymour Jones thesis, I think you would have to say that in their private diary and correspondence, somebody like Beatrice could have sustained a deliberate confusion for 50 years. And I think there are important psychological influences, but I don't think that is a fair thing. I'm just going to end by saying a little bit about sources. And of course, I've jumped a slide again. I've somehow managed to jump over. The most important area, perhaps I will just get out and get back to slide 18, because that's what we need. Right. Okay. The Webbs left such an enormous archive that they almost leave you an audit trail for their life. I quote this phrase at the beginning from two of these Edwardian Cambridge socialists, Hugh Dalton and Rupert Brooke. I want to tell you about the Webb diaries. We all come into them. They will be published 25 years after she dies. What have we got? 2 volumes of autobiography, by Beatrice, My Apprenticeship and Our Partnership, 3 volumes of collected letters, 4 volumes of diary. The diary only the published diary only quite a small part of the total. Edited by Norman and Jean Mackenzie, who I think inevitably made their own judgments about what was important and what was of interest. In the edited diaries, every now and then you come across 3 dots, which show where a passage has been left out. It's not immediately clear whether what's been left out is half a sentence or 3 months. Just to give an example, there was a passage about 2 women MPs coming to stay with them at Passfield Corner in the 1930s, Ellen Wilkinson and Jenny Lee. And in the middle of the middle of the entry, you get your 3 dots and it comes to an end. Why is this? Well, I think it is probably because Jenny Lee was still alive at the time when the edited diaries were, because she's quite caustic. Beatrice in the diary could be quite caustic. She's quite caustic about it. There is the huge advantage I think that anybody writing now has over the earlier writers is A, we can get the papers at all, but B, the LSE, supported by the Webb Memorial Trust, have put the entire diary, handwritten and typewritten, online. So you can, you don't have to go to LSE, you can log in and you can get it, you can find a practice, you can find a passage you need, you can even search for it. And that, I think, makes work on the diary, with the restricted hours of an archive and the need to order particular volumes, I think it would have been very, very difficult to do what you can do now. There is an issue which I have thought about a lot and look forward to discussing. Episodes for which the diary is the only source. Most of the information we have about Chamberlain's courtship of Beatrice comes from Beatrice's diary. And I think there's lots of stuff elsewhere that is not contentious, but I must say I was delighted when I found the very fragmentary autobiography that Beatrice's younger sister Rosie wrote, which just gives some extra evidence on the Chamberlain period. Certainly before I started this, I thought the Webb archive, the Passfield papers. Well, there are lots of other documents at LSE outside the Passfield papers collection. The Webb Local Government collection contains all the research notes from not only the history of local government, but a lot of the poor law work as well. In their Methods of Social Study, published in the 1930s, you read, and it's a passage I think a lot of people will be familiar with, this passage about each note on a separate sheet of paper, so you can put the notes together. Goodness knows they would have been unstoppable with personal computers, but you know, the thing about each note on a separate piece of paper, somewhere in the middle of the Webb Local Government collection, I suddenly found a bundle of the single sheets of paper, which was a very exciting discovery. In the course of the Poor Law report, at one stage he gets very angry. He says, I must have 6 proof copies of my evidence and all the evidence. Why does she want 6 proof copies? Because she cuts them up with razor blades and sticks them on the individual cards. So the Webb Local Government collection, interesting. The Trade Union collection, all the research work for the trade union books. The East Africa collection, in August 1931, when the Labour government falls, Sidney has a passage in a letter to Beatrice where he says, I spent the morning at the Colonial Office sorting out my papers, packing them into tin trunks and sending them off to our flat in Artillery Mansions, which they had at that time. Well, it's a fascinating thing. It's not the official papers. The official records of the Colonial Office are very, very good. But this is all the sort of political and private office stuff, the stuff that now would be the emails of the SPADs, you know, who is dealing with what correspondence is coming to him. So good stuff. The LSE's collections of Webb material are still growing. The Webbs never actually learned Russian to write about Russia. They relied on an emigre couple at LSE, Lucia and I think I forget what his name was, and Mr. and Mrs. Turin. Last year, the LSE bought a lot of Turin correspondence at auction, so it's good stuff. Also at the LSE, ILP, Fabian Society, Charles Booth, Tawney's collection, including about his abortive biography. But it's not just what's at LSE. National Archives. I was delighted to find Sidney's civil service personnel file, his letter of application written when he was 19, and his references. In the Prime Minister's series, two very good files. One, which I would say is a sort of working file kept by the officials in the room while the 1931 government was falling apart. And that's a wonderful collection of notes. But there's then another one from the Attlee government about the decision to arrange for Sidney and Beatrice's ashes to be placed in Westminster Abbey. And letters from Mr. Attlee to the Dean of Westminster saying this is a difficult thing. Somebody saying, well, we think they were free thinkers. All kinds of, so a very good classic file. Interestingly, the private secretary who dealt with it for Attlee was Lawrence Helsby, who later ended up head of the civil service. And then here and there are wonderful security service files. The security services kept an eye on G.D.H. Cole from 1913 when he was accused of fomenting a bus strike in Oxford. They kept the file until they kept track of him until the early 1950s. Stafford Cripps, Beatrice's nephew, winds up Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Attlee government. Special branch followed him from 1931-32 onwards. And you know, if you want to know what he said to meetings, the movement for colonial freedom, it's all there. Lots of stuff in the British Library, most of the secondary material I read there. Just a couple of manuscript areas I think are interesting. John Burns's diary. A lot of very routine stuff, but here and there some real gems. The diary, Beatrice's diary, is a transcribed typescript. Burns's diary is a real diary, a big foolscap annual diary bought from Boots the chemist's, with a day for each page and a sheet of blotting paper between each day. The Shaw papers. Loads of photographs, some of them at LSE, some of them at British Library. Labour Party Archive and the papers of the War Emergency Workers National Committee at the People's History Museum. And then at King's College, Cambridge, the Brooke papers and the Keynes papers. So lots of sources. One huge gap, which I felt for a long time. There is certainly a job for somebody one day to go and get access to the Russian archives and find out what they can from that side. I decided that learning Russian and getting access to the Russian archives, which I gather are more difficult now than in the past, was beyond my scope. But there's certainly something that ought to be done there. Finally, this is the famous Webb portrait, hangs in what's called the Shaw Library at the LSE, painted by William Nicholson, a leading portrait painter of the 1920s, funded by an appeal sent out by Beveridge, to which all kinds of people contributed, though Beatrice had a shrewd idea that most of the money did come from George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw, not very happy with the picture. He said, it's a good picture of the brickwork, but he had wanted Augustus John to come and paint them, and Beatrice would not have Augustus John in the house because he led an immoral life. Finally, that's the book. A bit of detail on my website, and that's where you can find me. So I'm going to stop share. Thank you for listening and open up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was excellent. Lots of new information there, and I especially appreciated the final section on the sources and some of the issues with the sources. Right, who wants to go first? Comments and questions to Michael. Just put your hand up either on the screen or on reactions. Somebody must want to start. There's so much here. Otherwise, I'll ask the first question, which Michael knows what's coming, but I want to take somebody else first.
I can see some points on chat. Shall I try and deal with them?
Yes, sorry. Yes, there are a couple of points on chat, so we'll take those first. Thank you.
Okay. What was the source of the Webb's income over these many years? A very good question, which I'm pleased to try and answer. I said that Beatrice's father was a successful businessman, Richard Potter, chairman of the Great Western Railway, and that he had these 9 daughters. He dies in January 1892. His will splits the estate between them, between the daughters, and from memory, they have capital of £26,000, which would provide them with an income of £1,000, which was enough to lead their lives the way they did. I don't think Beatrice was ever in salaried employment for any long period of time. Sidney had these periods, members of parliament were not paid, well, they were paid very little in the 1920s and 30s. He would have had short periods with a ministerial salary. So this, the £1,000 a year would have been their main source of income. And they managed to make it work. They didn't own a house until Passfield Corner. They bought Passfield Corner, but they I think were always tenants, and in fact they were always tenants on long leases at Grosvenor Road in London. So it was that, and in a way it was a slight source of friction between them in their courtship about the time that they're getting married. Sidney is first talking of standing for the LCC, and Beatrice says she's going to pay his election expenses. He says, "Then I'll be the member for Potter." She was Beatrice Potter, and I'll be the member for Potter. And I also see what Jan Powell has said about the recent book on Richard Potter. He was wealthy, a great supporter, and it's his will that keeps them all going, I think. So okay. I think I can see that you take the questions. Okay, you call people.
Yeah, Steve Cushion, you're first.
Yes, he was colonial secretary. What were their views on kind of colonialism, British imperialism, and all that sort of thing?
One of the great issues is, which I felt all the time in this, is trying to judge the politics of the 1920s and 30s by the beliefs and attitudes of the 1950s, 60s and 70s. I'll give the example of, basically, Sidney said, we can only go so fast. And that was, I think, a political judgment rather than a judgment about the substance. In the previous Conservative government, the colonial secretary had been Leo Amery, an imperialist in the Joseph Chamberlain mode. Though interestingly, Leo Amery had actually been a Fabian supporter and had been friendly, and indeed the Webb sorted out his first job for him, which was working for Leonard Courtney, the husband of Kate Courtney. Anyhow, by the 1920s, Leo Amery was a diehard imperialist. And his objective was to create a second South African dominion in the East African colonies, to bring together Kenya, Uganda, and the League of Nations mandate of Tanganyika into a settler-controlled political institution like that which existed in South Africa. Sidney had the idea, I say in the book, I don't think he was perfect, and I think that, and I don't think he was heroic or triumphant. And certainly there were people around, both Leonard Woolf, who was the secretary of the Labour Party Imperial and International Committee, and his junior minister, Sidney's junior minister, who thought he could have gone faster. But on the proposal to develop in South Africa, Sidney picked up a suggestion which had been made by the sympathetic members of the House of Lords, that there should be a joint committee of both Houses of Parliament to review this proposition. He was pressed by the Labour left, and there were interesting people in the House of Commons who took a close interest in these issues. A couple of them ex First World War conscientious objectors. He was pressed. If you're going to have a committee of this nature, you must get African witnesses to come and give evidence to you. This had never been done before, inviting people from the African colonies, for African people to come and give evidence to Parliament. And they did. Sidney had a great battle to get their expenses paid. I think it was on the whole a good thing for the civil service that once they had the decision, the civil service threw themselves into organising the transport, organising a programme for them in England. In 1931, there was no hotel in London would accommodate a delegation of 12 black Africans, and Sidney told the civil service, "You've got to solve this." They went out and found a holiday fellowship hostel in Sydenham that would put people up. And then the civil service put on a great program for them. And so the point about this is all the African witnesses, when they were heard, were totally against being put under this settler domination. The witnesses were handpicked people, chiefs and others known to the colonial administration. They were not representative of the liberation movement, which were in their infancy. Interestingly, Jomo Kenyatta, who was then a young man starting the what was called the Central Kikuyu organization, he came to England under his own steam, paid for by the association, and was seen by the junior minister, but he wasn't a formal witness. But in the end, the committee, and it wasn't a committee with a Labour majority, it was a minority government, the committee could not recommend in favour of closer union. When Amory was handing over to Sidney, he said, get this right. He said, "Yes, I cannot see any sense in inviting 12 unhappy niggers to London to give evidence to the House of Lords." So there was quite an obstacle to anything being done. I think that lots of people on the left thought he could have gone further, but in fact, he did stop the proposal for a second Dominion, and I think it was good that their version of it did get revived in the 1950s. Leonard Woolf was, on the whole, disappointed in Sidney and thought he could have gone further, but he did stop that from happening. There is another issue which I think is worth reading, which I haven't worked. The two aspects of Sidney's tenure at the Colonial Office I've looked at in some detail. One is this one about East Africa, and the other one is Palestine. But there are other issues. For example, Sidney Olivier, who had been a minister in the first Labour government and not the first, thought that much more could have been done for Caribbean sugar than was actually done. But I've not really been into the detail of that. So I suppose my answer to your question is heading in the right direction. Don't mistake the politics of the 20s and 30s for those 30 or 40 years later. But certainly, I think the prevention of the emergence of a second South Africa was a major achievement.
Thanks, Michael. Right, Kelvin Knight, you're next.
Right, thank you, and thanks for the talk. One thing that interested me was your statement that Labour Party made no advances in policy or new ideas between the first two Labour governments, and I take it you're attributing that in part to the Webbs as their intellectual dominance in the Labour Party. I infer from what you say is the case, but I wondered if you might have anything in general to say about their what used to be the common association or characterization of them as utilitarians. I'd be given that, according to Eli Halevi, perhaps the main historian of utilitarianism, Halevi's association of utilitarianism with laissez-faire. And, well, more particularly, I wondered if their utilitarianism might be the theoretical cause of the lack of intellectual innovation in the 1920s?
It's a very useful question, and I'm going to answer it in a slightly different kind of way. Sidney decided quite soon after the defeat of the Labour government that after the Parliament elected in 1924, he wouldn't stand for the House of Commons again. I don't think he initially thought there was a likelihood of a Labour government in 1929. And in the end, he went in with a peerage, having stood down as an MP. The second thing I want to say is I think the expectation of governments having an overarching concern with the management of the economy was not there in the 1920s. The Webbs had begun to talk about that in the Minority Report. One of the key bits of the Minority Report in 1909 is saying government should take responsibility for the organisation of the labour market in such a way as to minimise unemployment, which is heading in the direction of the 1944 Employment White Paper. It's heading in the direction of government having responsibility for the overall level of demand. There's an interesting encounter in the 1930s between Beatrice and Maynard Keynes, in which Beatrice said to Keynes, "We're all waiting for your book on employment and interest, Mr. Keynes," to which Keynes says, "Don't worry, Mrs. Webb, it's all in the Minority Report anyhow." So I suppose what I'm saying is that Sidney, and the other thing is their relationship with MacDonald as the leader of the Labour Party was very complicated. Bertrand Russell says somewhere that Beatrice really hated MacDonald all the way through. And she says very, very cryptic and caustic things about him. She says, MacDonald is the best available substitute for a leader of the Labour Party. MacDonald may not be the best person to be the leader of the Labour Party, but he's certainly a very dangerous person not to be the leader of the Labour Party. They had had rows with him on everything, and the Fabian Society, about the London School of Economics, about the London County Council, all the way through, leading up to a great denunciation by Sidney of MacDonald. All of which I say to say the Webbs were rather aside from the central formation of Labour policy in the 1924 to 9 period. There's a moment by Beatrice, and it's after 1929, where she says, nobody is doing the new thinking and we're not up to it. We're too old to do it. And then where the action is in two places. It's in the ILP, which they are not involved in, and it's with Keynes and the Liberal Party in the Liberal Party industrial strategy. That's where the thinking is at that point, but it's not going on. And I think this is because of the very narrow orthodoxy of Philip Snowden as the Chancellor. So I don't think, I agree they didn't do it, but I don't think it's either because they supported the drift. I mean, Beatrice says on a number of it, she's basically saying, listen, this stuff that Keynes and the ILP are on about, actually this is more serious than maintaining some of the things, some of the slogans that we've always talked about. There's a phrase that Taylor uses about the 1929 to 31 government. He says the new ideas were still too new. The other figure to mention in all this, who has a very complicated relationship with the other players in the story, the other figure in all this is Oswald Mosley, who joins comes in as a Conservative MP in 1918, becomes independent. By the time of by the early 1920s, he's a Labour MP. He is courting the ILP and the left, and the Webbs certainly see him in a period before he breaks away from Labour. They see him as a very leading figure in the party, and certainly somebody who's prepared to do it. Now, I've seen a good paper that somebody's done not long ago about Mosley not being a sort of proto-Keynesian, and I think there's a lot in that. Within the government, the crisis in the first year is about Mosley putting up. Mosley, who at that stage is a Labour minister, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, is putting up proposals on unemployment, and Snowden is knocking them down. So the new thinking, to some extent, is with Mosley. It's with the ILP, and it's with Keynes and the Liberals. The Webbs are quite sympathetic to what's going on outside. But I think probably despite the Minority Report, they haven't made that leap into the full future long-term responsibility of the Labour Party of national government for economic management. Happy to say more about that, but
okay.
Could I? Thanks very much for that. Would it be fair to infer that you don't find this term utilitarianism, a rather philosophical term, at all illuminating when we're talking about Webbs or the Labour Party more generally?
No. You've made a good point, and I don't feel it's not. I find it illuminating. I think yes, they came out of a background in which utilitarianism was one of the influences. By the 1920s, I don't think they were trying to make that kind. They could see the gaps and the weaknesses in what Labour was doing, but they weren't ready to. They weren't. I come back to this statement in early 1931 where there is a moment in early 1931 where this fragile minority government is nearly defeated. And Sidney says to Beatrice, I wouldn't say this to anybody else, but I wish we had been defeated last night because nobody is doing the thinking and I don't know how to do it now. And I think that in a sense that goes beyond the issue of where their original intellectual influences had come from. At some point, Beatrice actually says, I think the stream of ideas we put forward from the 1890s onwards, the national minimum, etc., which had been their main, I think we've come to the end of that road and we need something new and something different.
Okay, can I bring in Francis King now? Francis.
Oh yeah, thank you. I mean, as well, could you say something a bit more about the foundation of LSE? I've always been fascinated by the idea that a couple of Fabians could sort of set up a college with an endowment and then get it taken on and adopted somehow by the University of London. I was wondering what kind of strings you needed.
Sorry, you want me to say more about the foundation of the LSE?
And how they got what was initially, as you said, a kind of Fabian initiative to be officially adopted by the University of London. I mean, it seemed quite an interesting achievement.
Yes, I think it's smoke and mirrors, and now you see it, now you don't. I mean, there is basically, they're left with this will, which I don't think they knew about until after the bloke died, Hutchinson died. They're left with this will, which says, I'm leaving this money to advance the socialism of the Fabian Society. And it's full of other legalisms, like, and I appoint the said Webb to be my trustee and the said Webb to do this, that, and the other. And they go off to get counsel's opinion from Richard Haldane, who is at this stage a rising liberal QC, a rising parliamentarian. Much later, he's Lord Chancellor in the first Labour government, but much later. They go to Richard Haldane for their counsel's opinion, and they draw out lots of things: the organisation of courses on economic subjects, the sponsoring of parliamentary candidates. You see, MacDonald, who was watching them like a hawk, had got wind of the bequest. He wanted it used to sponsor parliamentary candidates, i.e. J.R. MacDonald. And MacDonald came up with various other projects, but so the list A to H or something like that of purposes, and Haldane goes through. Yes, I think you can do all these within the terms of the request. Perhaps not parliamentary candidates, but you can do most of it. Beveridge, and his account must be second-hand because he's not on the scene till a few years later, said, gives an account of the conversation between Haldane and Sidney, in which Haldane says, Mr. Webb, are you a convinced socialist? You remain a convinced socialist, yes. Do you believe that by rigorous inquiry into the facts, the case for socialism, of social and economic conditions, the case for socialism will be advanced? Yes, says Sidney. Well, in that case, you can run an academic institution to that is how you can bring this within the terms of reference. Now, George Bernard Shaw, a couple of years later, says that the Webbs are doing it all wrong with the LSE. It says that this money is given for the advancement of socialism. You must beat the drum for collectivism and sing the Marseillaise at every opportunity if you're to deliver on that. And Sidney basically says no to that. That's not the way we're doing it. So they say that this money given for the advancement of socialism can be used to run an academic institution. They justify it in this way about an objective inquiry into the facts is going to make the case for socialism. And they then compound that by not appointing flag-waving socialists to the top jobs. As I say, the first two directors of the LSE were conservatives who ended up conservative MPs, one an economic historian, the other an economic geographer. The third director of the LSE is a socialist, Pemba Reeves, and the fourth director, Beveridge, interestingly, like Keynes, never actually becomes a socialist himself, but he's very close to the Webbs all his life. So I think the way they do that, in a way, they hedge what they're doing with legal opinion. They try not to frighten the horses by having too flagrant publicity. And I think they do believe, as Beveridge says they tell Haldane, that objective inquiry into the facts is going to make people socialists.
Thanks very much, Michael. Right, I'll throw my question while I'm waiting for anybody else, which is, could you say a bit more about Sidney Webb's influence on the Liberal Party, especially in his time in the LCC? Because, I mean, he actually wrote, the Labour program, the London programme, which was effectively the manifesto for the Progressives in the election. He was on the Progressive Leadership Group, and he also basically pushed the Progressives and the Liberals in the LCC to actually recognise the role of council rates as a way of redistributing basically assets and value, which is obviously the basis of some of the attempts at sort of planning gain and land value tax that we have at present. So I just think his role in pushing the New Liberals away from laissez-faire into state interventionism is really not sufficiently recognised.
Good. Okay. As you made the point in the review, I feel with hindsight I probably don't say enough about the London programme. Sidney was part of the alliance between various shades of liberal opinion and various shades of Labour opinion that made up the Progressive Party. When he got onto the LCC in 1892, he was immediately part of the leadership of that group. Once he was on the LCC, he focused very much on education policy and had a great success until he, I think, fell out with nonconformist opinion, as I was saying earlier, about the role of organized religion in the education system. And there is a point in, I think, 1903 or 1904 when the progressive leadership says to Sidney, where they basically vote him off the leadership, and the chief whip says to Sidney, up till now, Webb, you've led us by the nose. Now it's your turn to follow. So he is part of that broad current that gets London government going, and he works as part of that group. I think his actual time on the council is very preoccupied with education and getting education going, though I'm batting on. I could do more work on this.
Thanks very much, Michael. Right, any other questions or comments? I can't see anybody else waving. This is your last chance. Okay, Michael, do you want to make any concluding comments?
No. I thank you all for listening. Every discussion like this I have helps me and moves me on and shows me stones I haven't turned or questions I haven't asked. So it's all very good. Thank you all very much for contributing. If you want to know more, I put perhaps I'll I'll put it up as we finish. I put my website on the last slide, so that will give you a means of contacting if you would like to. Otherwise, thank you all very much. Very good discussion.
Okay, thanks very much. If I can just say a couple of things about the Socialist History Society before we finish. Do join the Socialist History Society. We publish twice a year our peer-reviewed journal, Socialist History. We also publish a couple of occasional publications a year, sort of mini books or pamphlets on various aspects of socialist history, whether British or international. We also publish a newsletter for members, which we hope that members will contribute to in terms of telling us, what their research and other books and so forth. We also publish some book reviews in the journal, mainly relating to what has been written by members. Our next two online events, similar to this, are both 7 o'clock. 29th of October, a speaker on museums of the Revolution, and on 19th of November, a speaker has written a biography of Paul Foote. We will also be, putting on our website information about future events. We normally have an event of this kind about once a month. So do join the society and do keep an eye on the events we're running. So thank you all for attending, and thanks especially to Michael for an excellent presentation.